Hi, everyone. We're going to start again. We have a great panel to start off the afternoon, and I'm actually taking myself off of the panel to make it even better because we've had a lot of energy conversation today, and that's my background and my passion. So our first forum is perhaps a little energy skewed, and we have other incredibly important sectors that I want us to be able to dig into this afternoon. And we have a fantastic moderator, Harry Griffith, who I introduced earlier, and so I'll turn it over to him immediately as we are a bit behind schedule. Thanks, everybody, for being here in the afternoon, though.
Okay, so it looks like we've got some good traction here. I see, a lot of seats still filled. If you fall asleep, I won't sort of point you out, but do keep your eyes open. So I'm going to be a very light moderator, but I do want to pose a broad set of questions for the panelists and maybe tease people a little bit before they start to talk about what they're doing. And that is, I want to think about this from the standpoint of local tools, local opportunities that we in the community can take to improve our resilience. So this is sort of a halfway house between, generically the last panel was sort of almost like a global investment perspective or a national investment perspective. I'd like to bring it a little bit down closer to home, to the Wood River Valley or Blaine County or whatever you want to call us. And I think we have some panelists here who have some really good insights at things that we could start doing or ways we could start thinking about resilience that actually would lead to action for us. So for our first speaker, Ken White, who's with the Post-Carbon Institute, one of the things I'd like him to try to address for us is we've heard an awful lot about energy. We all love energy. I'm an energy guy. But we haven't heard about some of the other issues. Less so about water, less so about some of the other things that we're interested in, whether it's health or resilience in education. But there's the softer side of resilience, which is about sort of the community, about people's lives, social side of things. So I'd really like to try to ask Ken to tease out some of those things which are less obvious. It's not about solar farms. It's not about, water meters. But what makes a resilient community from a personal, family, humanistic standpoint?
Sure, thanks. And I have two apologies. First of all, I'm going to read from notes a little bit because this is something we were working on at 5:45 on Friday before I got on the plane yesterday to come here. So I'm still getting familiar with the language that we've been negotiating within our organization. We're working on a community resilience framework to be published shortly. Second of all, to paraphrase Ronald Reagan, who famously said, "I'm here from the government and I'm here for help." That's kind of a mocking, I'm here to help, that was kind of a mocking reference. I'm here from a think tank, and I'm not here to bore you with wonky details and statistics. So please bear with me if I go there and kind of wave your hand and say, don't go there. About Post-Carbon Institute, just to situate this work, we're a think tank. We've been working for 12 years on issues related to community resilience. And how we got there is we have a twofold mission. The first part is to look at the very macro trends in energy, environment, economy, and social equity, and where those are headed, sort of a very big macro analysis. And then, strangely enough, our second part of our mission is where do we think there's the most effective action that can be taken? And that actually brings us to community resilience. That is, building resilience in individual communities like we've been talking about all morning. And so what I'm going to try and do now is kind of bridge those two and talk about why some of the things that you're practicing are very helpful and valuable and kind of situate them a little bit. So we have 30 fellows who help us with our work. We do research. We've been doing field mapping. We've been doing a lot of interviews with folks, both thought leaders and practitioners, to help us develop this community resilience framework. We have products like, I brought these along, so I figured I'd use them as visuals. Community resilience guides, the first one on local investing, written by Michael Schumann, and also on community food and community energy. So I just wanted to wave those around, and the person who asks the best question will get a copy of these, so I don't have to take them back with me. And in developing this community resilience draft, we went back and sort of tried to tease out sort of what were the macro trends and how could people respond. And one of the first things that comes out of that is a community is the place where we can both experience and respond meaningfully to these large global forces, these large macro forces, right? So we can feel the impact. Oh, sorry, you can just flip ahead. Sorry. So we can feel the impact of our actions at the local level, and that gives us a sense of efficacy and a sense of the ability to actually have some impact both in our community and at the national and global level. So that's why that's on the one end of the scale. On the other end of the scale is what you were just alluding to, which is the sort of personal and family resilience, which is of course incredibly important because it's a building block of the larger sense of resilience. But it's in community that these things actually begin to come together. And the reason why is that we humans are profoundly social and relational. We get together all the time in meetings like this, right? This is what we do as human beings. We are born into relationships and we evolve in community. And we grow in community and we develop in community. We live in community. So the scale for us that seems to be the most relevant for both the ability to sense and feel the impact and also what we have as a species evolved to do is at the community level. And in terms of resilience, the next slide, please. One of the things that comes up in this is that what we think of as community resilience is not inherently new. These are things that our grandparents or great-grandparents probably tried to tell us about. These are things that indigenous communities have practiced for millennia of living together in place-based communities. These are things that oppressed and marginalized communities have practiced because they've had to. So this is not something where we're inventing out of whole cloth an entirely new category, an entirely new way of living. Yes, the times are changing, but there are practices and there are lessons that we can learn that can be applied in these changing times. So if the next slide, please. So if we put community and resilience together, we get this definition, which is the capacity of a community to maintain and evolve its identity in the face of both short and long-term challenges, while cultivating social equity, economic security, and ecological stability. And that sounds a lot like some of the definitions that have been bandied about here. We've talked about brittle systems, making them more flexible and adaptable. Rockefeller Foundation has done a great job of developing an overarching framework, and we've looked at several others. One thing I want to tease out about this, though, is that this definition implies a strong commitment to social, economic, and environmental justice. It's true that true community resilience is inclusive. It's also true that community resilience is built on strong relationships with other communities that are practicing resilience, and I know Astrid will talk a little bit about some ways that can be done. It's also very pragmatic, because if we don't build inclusive community resilience, we won't be able to survive long term. Short term, sure, we can do that, and maybe it'll work, but long term, we are going to need to be able to have all our capacities brought to bear, and we're going to need to be able to build relationships that last for generations so that we can continue to evolve and grow together. So one of the things we got out of our community resilience framework is these 6 characteristics, and I'll just start with the first one, which is people-centered. So this is where the social equity component really starts to kick in and the relational component really starts to kick in. The community has to envision together the kind of future it wants. So this goes beyond the sort of standard citizen participation in government or blue ribbon panels. It implies also that people are people, and by the way, corporations are not people. It implies that everyone is included, and it implies that this is an ongoing process. So the second one is systemic. And this is where we get back to those sort of larger challenges in energy, economy, equity, environment, pick your choice. And again, these are outside of any individual's community's control, but they're all interrelated. And beginning to push against any one of them, you have to think about the impact on all the others, as well as the impact on your region and sort of the national and global scale. So it's a really complicated process to try and be paying attention to the systemic aspects, but it's one that, again, is the only way we're going to move towards long-term sustainability as opposed to short-term interventions. So just from California, where I'm coming from, an example of how not to be systemic, we're talking about desalinating water as a way of dealing with our current drought, which sounds good, more water, right? But it's incredibly energy intensive and resource intensive thing to do. So we would be short term solving a water problem, but long term exacerbating an energy and a climate problem. So the next characteristic of community resilience is that it's evolutionary. So as Nancy was talking about earlier, resilience is a process of being and doing. It's not an end state. There's nothing set in stone because the conditions that we're going to be facing are not likely to remain constant. And we're already seeing this, and I know just in talking to people who are from this region that you're already seeing it as well. You can't predict the weather from one year to the next. You can't know where the trends are headed. So if you begin to think about that and multiply the number of factors in that equation, simply saying, okay, we solve that problem and move on to the next one. No, it's a constant process. And just as no two communities, just as no two people are alike, no two communities will end up being alike in the solutions they implement. The fourth characteristic is transformational. And as I alluded to earlier, everything from governance to economic relationships to cultural patterns has to be open to change. And even in some cases, radical change. Because incrementalism is not going to solve the kind of large-scale problems that we're dealing with, systemic problems. The next characteristic is sustainable, as I've been talking about. Just an example of this that we see. If you take monocrops and plant them 200 miles north because you think you're going to outpace global warming, well, that might solve the problem for a couple of years of the climatic shifts, even if we don't know what those climatic shifts might do. They might yield more rain or longer dry cycles. But given the utter reliance of the industrial food system on fossil fuel inputs and on intensive water use, that's probably not a long-term sustainable strategy to continue to try and recreate the industrial food system. So the final one, and this gets back to the softer side of things, is courageous. No great work was ever accomplished without a vision that extends beyond our lifetimes. So communities will have to address how we got here. What are the injustices and losses that we've suffered? What are the challenges that we're facing? What are the future opportunities and what are the future uncertainties? And then build the kind of emotional and relational resilience, both at the personal level and in our relationships with each other, to begin to proceed anyway, despite the fact that these are very daunting challenges, and to do it with a sense of purpose and a sense of hope. So that's a very high-level overview of the community resilience framework that we've developed. Again, coming out of all this sort of wonky research into these mega trends, what it comes back to in the end is the human capacity for relationship and the human capacity to work together to address really big challenges that have generational long consequences. So I appreciate your patience while I've read through this because it doesn't sound like a very polished presentation, but we are in the draft stage, which is why I'd really welcome your thoughts and comments and questions about this. In case we don't get to connect in person, that's my email up there. I really do invite you to visit our site, resilience.org. There's a wealth of resources there. We get 1.5 million annual visitors, and we'd love to have you be the 1.5 million 0001 next person to come and visit our site. So thanks very much.
Great, thank you, Ken. So our next speaker is Astrid Scholz. And again, I think representing a relatively new organization that's sort of learning as they go and coming up with some innovative ways to connect communities and to create sort of knowledge networks or expert opportunities to ask questions or to get answers. So I'd like to ask Astrid, what do you think, what are some common links between resilient communities? How do you think that people can share or otherwise get lessons learned and apply those? What are some tools and mechanisms that will enable communities, whether it's ours or others that are sort of in the forefront of resilience, to make them better capable and adaptive for the future?
Great. Thanks, Harry. And it's great to be here and be part of this amazing community group that is coming together to figure this stuff out and grapple these really difficult challenges facing us in the 21st century right here where you live. By way of deconstructing that slightly mysterious remark about a relatively new organization, if by new you mean incorporated as of April 1st, yes, it's that new. I am a Gen X nonprofit executive turned tech entrepreneur. I left the organization I was running until last October, EcoTrust out of Portland, Oregon, to take an initiative that we had incubated there out into a now standalone for-profit social enterprise that, if we do it right, will disrupt the way we do social change. The business model of social change, in our opinion, needs disrupting, and I think Rosalie alluded to that a little bit in her remarks earlier, so we should talk a little bit more. But the upshot here is that when you look at an organization like EcoTrust, and I'll get to your question here in a minute. No, let me get there right away. So, so what you were asking, how are communities similar, right? We're similar in that we all need the same things, right? Food, energy, water, shelter, reliable finance. Hello, Greece. My home country of Germany is doing terrible things to the Greek people right now. We all have the same needs. How we meet those needs differs by where we live, right? By what we have available in terms of natural, social, and economic capital. So there are what's the same among communities is that we all have the same needs, and the systems that provide us with the things we need to live well in the 21st century have become incredibly vulnerable, brittle, call it what you will. We need strategies for literally survival, right? And so there are organizations like EcoTrust or Sun Valley Institute all over the world. You're not alone. But what is odd, given some of the mega trends in the 21st century, given that we heard about the power of capital, I want to talk a little bit about the power of technology. What is odd is that I can go to my iPhone, I can go to the App Store, I can download, the 15th release of some silly game involving Angry Birds or whatever. But there's nowhere I can go as a practitioner working on resilience solutions and download, access, easily digest, repurpose, remix for my community and my challenges what somebody somewhere else is already working on. This is silly. And if I'd met Mark Zuckerberg at the airport this morning, I would have tackled him, But instead, what we said is, well, okay, Silicon Valley isn't going to solve this for us, so it might as well be us. And that is my personal, all those characteristics resonate on a personal level. Courageously and with purpose and hope, I'm reinventing myself as a tech entrepreneur because we see that opportunity and this grave need to make the life of organizations like yours easier by essentially making it easy and rewarding to discover, share, and remix solutions from anywhere in the world. So take something like what EcoTrust has been working on with school lunches. So over the last 5 or 6 years, we've worked really hard trying to get local produce into the local lunch supply, school lunches. Why? Because institutional buyers of food are one of the biggest economic movers of the food system. And if you're trying to relocalize and regionalize your food system, you have to work with the institutional buyers and make it easy for them to buy from local growers. Great. So we figured it out and worked on all different levels with new modeling tools, economic analysis, a lot of policy work, and EcoTrust is an organization that doesn't like to do a lot of lobbying, but here we were lobbying in Salem, and lo and behold, we got some money appropriated by the state legislature, and just the other day, more money was designated to this purpose, and now we're beginning to see chug-a-lug, starting from one school, branching out to the whole school district, to now the state, we're beginning to get traction with a new solution of how you get local produce into the food of school children, into the mouths of school children, and generate this nice kick-on effect with employment and whatnot. So now, in my old position, I would now be beating my chest saying, look at EcoTrust, look how great we are. Yes, to all that. But more importantly, what do we now do with that practical knowledge? How do we share it? Well, how do we make it available so somebody else can find it? And maybe if they, want to give us attribution and rewards for it, maybe even license the model, all the better. That infrastructure doesn't exist, and that's why we're building it. And I have hope that in not very long, There will be great solutions in food, energy, water, and all the other systems you're making interventions in that we can serve up on the resilience exchange, the sort of global hive mind of practical solutions that will help us survive the 21st century. And I encourage you, of course, to partner with us in any way that makes sense so that we can make available to you, on a mobile app coming soon, these great solutions that might benefit your planning and your work right here in this community.
Thank you, Astrid. Our next panelist is Shawn Penner. Shawn is a professor at Boise State University, and Shawn has been working on, am I going out of order? No, I'm just going off the list.
I was going down the panel.
Yeah, that's right. You get a few more minutes to relax and compose yourself. Anyway, yeah. Anyway, Shawn is working on a very interesting project that Boise State has taken on, and it's I understand called Project 2050. It's a collaborative project across the entire university, and I think if we bring this down a little bit more locally to Idaho, and think about what's happening at Boise State, what they're working on, it'd be very interesting to hear perhaps how this project or this program could be linked with things that we're doing or that other communities of our size and circumstances are working on. So with that, over to you.
Thank you, Harry. So as a professor, I know that my first job is to not use big, weird words that no one understands. So I'm going to start with one. We live in a world that's the term that the scientists are using now is that our world has become non-stationary. And I think this is a really useful word because we're used to thinking about non-stationary worlds in terms of economies, and that is that they change over time. But now we live in a place where the climate is going to alter the landscape we live in a way that is going to be profound. And I think Sun Valley, I would argue this is probably the single greatest vulnerability that this community faces, and indeed all of Idaho. And we are, in order to do something about that, we need data about what the future looks like. And we're interested in trying to partner with Sun Valley to try to create that data. And so just returning to Cory Booker's statement this morning about in God we trust, but if you want anything from me, bring me some data. And we'd like to participate in that. We'd like to help you all create the data you need to make good decisions. And we've recently launched a fairly large initiative focused on exactly this topic. That is, we're trying to build the capacity at Boise State and also at the other institutions in the state, University of Idaho and Idaho State University, to study what we call human environmental systems. So trying to understand better how the coupling of our activities and the natural world work together to create these synergies, which ultimately lead to change into the future. And if we want to be resilient, we need to have some kind of vision of what that future might look like. Right? And so we are tackling this kind of impossible problem, really, of trying to peer into the future and give you all the tools to make good decisions now so that you can prepare for that future. And so I just wanted to start by, and I was going to be really short just because it seems like there's a lot of us. I just want to kind of give you a couple hypothetical questions that I think we'd like to work on. So you are, as a community, face a very, I think, uncertain future. And I think that there's questions that you would probably like to know. For example, you would like to know whether in 2050 you are going to have enough snow to ski on, right? You would like to know the answer to that. You would like to know, for example, more specifically, maybe we won't have enough snow falling out of the sky, but could we make snow? Is it going to be cold enough in the winter at night to make snow? There's a bunch of questions like that you would like to know. We talked about this morning that someone mentioned the efforts to try to revegetate in response to the fire. People are going up there and planting trees. Well, it might be good to ask yourself what kind of trees we should plant. right? Because a tree grows for 50 years or 100 years, we will have a different climate in 50 years. We should plant a tree up there that can still survive under those conditions, right? We would like to try to solve that problem. What else? We'd like to know, obviously you'd like to know, what is the fire regime going to look like in the future? And again, we're not all knowing, but we would like to try to figure out ways of predicting what that future might look like. Lastly, coming back to the last two talks, one of the things we're really interested in, as well as understanding these kind of the physical side of the picture, is we are really interested in trying to figure out what you guys as a community will look like in 50 years. Because ultimately, as the demographics of the valley change, your values will change and your priorities will change, and those things will ultimately dictate the decisions that you make. I want to end with just a quick kind of small story from the current project. So we're working in the Treasure Valley right now, and you could go to maybe the last slide.
That's hard to see.
Not there. Go back. So we're working on a project, a couple of faculty are working on this project in the Oahe Mountains. The one with the eagle picture on it. There, stop there. A picture, they're working in the Oahe Mountains on trying to help solve a problem. So there's this problem there where you have eagles nesting in the cliffs in the Oahes, which are sort of the foothills to the south of the Treasure Valley. And those eagles are being disrupted by lots of recreational activity, in particular off-road vehicle use. And normally you would imagine that as a biologist, we would go out there and we'd be, studying the eagles and pissed off at the off-road vehicle riders because they were disrupting our eagles. But we've taken a very different approach. And so these two faculty, Julie Heath and Katie Demps, have actually engaged the community out there and are studying the eagles with the help of the off-road vehicle users. And they've actually go out there. It's really funny. We have videos of our ponytailed graduate student going out and having these conversations with the off-road vehicle riders, and then convincing them to put tracking devices on their motorcycles, and then keeping track of where they go and seeing where that disrupts the eagles. It turns out, that the eagles aren't bothered by the motorcycles. They're bothered by the motorcycle stopping.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so there's a solution, right? Because we sort of engage in a way, we could come up with a solution where we just say, look, in this little section, let's just make this a non-stopping section. We can solve the problem without disrupting their recreation, and we make the life better for the eagles. So we're very interested in trying to find solutions to problems where you integrate the people with the biophysical science side of the story. So I'll stop there.
Great. Thank you, Shawn. Great story there on that one. We're going to dive down a little bit more locally now. Carol's going to be
Can I switch seats with you so I can see the, thank you.
up next. Our next panelist is Carol Brown. She's with the Sawtooth Forest. And for those of you that aren't familiar with the area, we are surrounded by lots of forest. I think you saw my slide earlier with the little sliver of where our towns are. You can go hundreds of miles in all directions and find nothing else. So Idaho, but in particular this area, I think in particular, are really important components of our interaction with people like the BLM, National Forest Service, and others is really critical. So understanding how the forest side of things in the federal government can help us think about resilience, I think is a great lesson and very germane, given our recreational assets and our community's desires and activities. So turn it over to Carol and ask her to talk a little bit about some of the things that the Forest Service is working on.
Thank you very much. And Shawn, you had a perfect lead-in for mine. So you really set it up nicely. Thank you. So I am Carol Brown. I'm with the Sawtooth National Forest. Moved here 35 years ago to be a ski bum. Surprisingly, I'm still here and still hoping to ski So I have a vested interest in what I'm about to discuss. So I'm going to talk about some work the Forest Service is doing on climate change, specifically the vulnerability and adaptation planning. I have my little tagline there, you know, when water flows and snow falls and fire matters, we better start paying attention. Now, let's see if I can do this. Did it work? All right, so the first thing you want to do for vulnerability and adaptation planning is what's called the downscaled climate change model. Because we can talk about western-wide, hotter, drier, maybe hotter, wetter, but there's some principles you want to dig down and get down to the local area. And we are so fortunate in that in the Big Wood River and the Little Wood River already, we've had a downscaled climate change model done for us. So if you were to go search the web and just put in the words, Big Wood Climate Change Model, John Stevenson was hired to do this through some water users, you will find this web page well worth your time to go see. And what he explains all the science behind the modeling, but his model and the same with the Littlewood model that the University of Washington did for us show kind of the same thing. Generally, high confidence that it's going to be getting warmer in those models. So the question is whether it's going to get warmer 3 to 5 degrees in 50 years or 10 to 13 degrees, but high confidence in the warming piece, less confidence in the drier, but still predicting more drier. So you want to do that first because you want to know what's going to be happening with our climate in your region. So after you do that, then you want to start to assess how are the resources vulnerable to this climate change. And this is a pretty big process we've undertaken. We're doing the Forest Service is doing it for the Intermountain region right now. It's already been done for what we call our northern region, Montana area. The Pacific Northwest has already been done in areas in that area. So we're actually like number 4 coming along, getting it done here. Oh, so 2 pieces to it, and I'll talk about each of these specifically. Vulnerability assessments first, adaptation comes second. So the vulnerability assessment is done by the scientists. This is very much a science piece. This is the literature research. What do we know? What do our GIS facts tell us about where the streams are? All these things that are going on. Our scientists have to take a hard look at all sorts of natural resources from wildlife, the forested veg, the non-forested veg, which we call sagebrush grass. We look at all those things and we evaluate each of those, the fuels, and we say, now knowing what our climate may change, how is each of these resources vulnerable and affected? Some cases not affected at all, some cases greatly affected. So we want to tease out which of these resources is going to be most affected and start to look at that. Once they've done that, and they will actually produce a peer-reviewed document that explains all of this, the second piece then is we go and we say, okay, now that we know that our lodgepole pine forests are already, they're already fire adapted and they're susceptible to fire, but if we increase drying and it's warmer and less wet, here's what we can expect to see in our lodgepole pine forests, for example. Where's our persistent snow layer going to be? If you're a wolverine and you need persistent snow layers to den in March, where are you in the spring? Where are you going to find that to put your den? If you're a backcountry skier, you're going to be going up higher maybe to find that persistent snow layer come spring. Is the snow going to come later and leave earlier? Are we going to see more rain on snow events? And so what we do is we look at all of these things and we ask ourselves, how are we going to adapt to this change, now knowing this? So I'm going to run through some very simple examples just to give you a sense of how this works. So the vulnerability, so we're going to talk about, let's pretend our model showed us and our vulnerability assessment showed us we had higher peak flows in the fall and winter than we previously had. So we know our strategy is our infrastructure, we need to start accommodating that because in the past we didn't have those kind of flows. So a very simple tactic, we look at our culverts, we look at our roads and we start to say, are these the right sized culverts? Do we need to put bigger culverts in to accommodate the flow? Do we need to pull the road out because now what didn't used to be a floodplain is a floodplain? And my campgrounds, of course, we care about those. Another example is fisheries. Again, very simple example. We know we have a wonderful cold trout fisheries here. We love our fishing here. It's great. And if you get out, I hope you can, go fish. But higher temperatures kill fish, a lot of cold water fish. We just know that. So we know, real simple, we need to restore and maintain some of our streams. Obviously, the tactic in this case is going to be, we're going to be out planting, restoring those streams. What's important, though, is that we go and restore them in the right places. So we want to figure out where the strongholds are for that fish, and that's where we want to go put our energies. Okay, one last example here, vegetation. We all have seen a lot of wildfire in the past decade here in this valley. We're seeing our fires start earlier. They go later in the season, and when I was a young firefighter in 1980, the kind of fire behavior I saw and the size of fires I saw were completely different than what I see now at the end of my career. 50,000 acres was a huge fire back in the day. Those are pretty routine now. So we know we have wildfire. We got to figure out how we're going to make our forest around the urban interface more resilient. Pretty straightforward. Our tactic, we're thinning the stands around houses. We're trying to look at manage the forest to be more resilient itself. It's not just people that are resilient, it's the forest as well. And if you manage your resources to be resilient, that ties right into the community. The two are intertwined. The old joke, if a tree falls in the forest and no one hears it, kind of, if we don't care about our resources, if the resources didn't affect us, it wouldn't matter what they did. But they affect us greatly, and we all know that. So, so we need to actually start planning for a variable climate. We need to start incorporating that into, if you're a city or a county, you should be asking this question right alongside the Forest Service and the BLM. How do I need to think with this ordinance about, will climate change affect something? You can make good decisions with uncertainty. You don't have to sit back and wait for everything to be perfect. For example, I said we don't know from the models whether it's in the next 50 years whether we're going to get warmer by 5 degrees, we're going to get warmer by 13 degrees. We're getting warmer. We know that. We need to start planning now. We're having these conversations already in the Forest Service. Should we be thinking about developing recreation resources up at a higher elevation? Are we going to start seeing more people come up higher and try to get into our backcountry than ever before because it's cooler up here? They already do now to a certain extent. So some key concepts about adaptation. You want to think about, can we do something that makes it more resilient, the resource more resilient? That's one way to do it. Can we allow it to transition to something else then that is desirable and resilient? Or can we find a way to just maintain? But a lot of our resources, we're expecting transition, not because we're doing anything. It's going to happen. So I mentioned we're undertaking a vulnerability assessment right now. It started a few months ago. We actually have one of the scientists that's on that team in the audience. Karen, raise your hand, Karen Dante, because if anybody wants to talk to her afterwards, it's good to have the hard science right there. And so the scientists who are working on that, they're going to compile a peer-reviewed literature piece and publish it for this greater region. We're a sub-region of what's being done, but the Wood River Valley is part of it. And then next comes the adaptation planning, and that's where the community can get involved. So they will hold meetings all around the region where they're doing this. I'm working hard on persuading them to hold one here, not just Boise. And that's where we all come together and we start talking about, okay, if we're going to have lower water flows, what does that mean, community? Do we need to have more water storage cities? Do you need to provide for more water storage? Do we need to have better ordinances relative to our water use? Those are the kind of questions we need to be talking about now. Because again, the natural resources don't just sit by themselves, they affect you. Oh, that's it. So, okay.
Thank you, Carol. It's a marvelous science. There's really some great thinking going on in Boise and the local institutions. And for those of you that want to corner Carol offline, I'm sure she'll run a Monte Carlo simulation for the first powder day next year. With that, I'm going to turn to Jim Keating, who's going to, Jim is the head of the Blaine County Recreation District, or BCRD as we call it. Jim has been engaged in a lot of our recreational activities and opportunities across the community. Jim's also a member of the 5B Restoration Coalition, which is what we've asked him to talk about. That's a group that really was formed on the backside of the fire a couple years ago. And I think it's a great example of a community in action to say, what can we do to avoid the next one or to ameliorate its impacts? So, Jim.
Hi, everybody. How we doing? We good? Little gut check? Shake it out? Yes, my name is Jim Keating. I'm the Executive Director of the Blaine County Recreation District, and we have the honor here locally to be connected to Carol and the Forest and the BLM and Mark at Trout Unlimited as we work to provide recreational amenities really throughout the valley, both in the cities and then it's amazing resources we have outside the cities. I want to talk a little bit about the Restoration Coalition as kind of one of those strategies that has emerged since this huge event, which was the Beaver Creek Fire. But first, I'd like to start with a video.
Never come with a warning. A revolution never sends you an omen. A revolution just arrive like the morning. Ring the alarm, we come to wake up the snoring. They're telling you to never worry about the future. They're telling you to never worry about the torture. They're telling you that you will never see the horror. Spend it all today and we will bill you tomorrow. 3-piece suits and bank accounts in Bahamas. Wall Street crime will never send you to the slammer. Tell all the children in the arms of the mamas. The F-15 is a homicide bomber. TV commercial for a pop-up pill culture. Drug companies circling like a vulture. Amaraki babies with the G.I. Joe father. 10 years from now, is anybody gonna bother your fire? Never sends you an omen. A revolution never come with a warning. A revolution. Everyone addicted to the same nicotine. Everyone addicted to the same gasoline. Everyone addicted to a technicolor screen. Everybody trying to get their hands on the same green. From the banks of the river to the banks of the greedy. All of the rich is taken back by the needy. We come from the country and we come from the city. Play us on a record, you can play us on a CD. All the shit you giving us is fertilizer. The seeds that you planted, you can never brutalize. Tell the corporation you can never globalize it. Like Peter Tosh said, legalize it. Girls and boys hear the bass and the treble. Rumbling the speakers in and make you wanna rebel. Throw your hands up, take it to another level. And you never ever ever make a deal with the devil. Yeah, fire. Throw your hands
So big thanks to the forest for sharing that video. The reason I thought that might be interesting for everyone to take a look at again is because it's been about a couple years, since that fire happened, and it was an incredible event in the lives of the people that lived here, in the habitat clearly around it, and our visitors. And I think that video gives you a little sense of scale too, as we sit here and talk about these events and these impacts to resilience, to see that kind of physical impact that was all part of our lives 2 years ago. It's important to be kind of reminded of that impact. And just to talk a little bit more about what really happened during that fire. Do you have that first slide up? Mm-hmm. So this first slide shows the fire impacted area. You see that big Pac-Man shape coming to eat Ketchum? That's the fire, that's the Beaver Creek fire, but inside the mouth of the Pac-Man is actually the last fire, the Castle Rock fire. And as Carol mentioned, over 50,000 acres burned used to be a pretty darn big fire. This was 112,000 acres burned, which is really, really significant. The overall impact was felt by all of us, I think. And you also saw over $21.5 million worth of direct fire suppression costs in that whole effort, which gives you another sense of scale over and across the board. So looking at this next slide, you just get a better sense of what really happened on the ground. You saw some of those images from before, but the impacts were really diverse. In my business, we're working on trails and recreational experiences for the community, but all of these things really blended in this fire. You had total impacts to habitat, from the watersheds to the vegetation to the wildlife to the fisheries, and also obviously the infrastructure of trails and roads, which often enable our access as members of the community to get into these environments and enjoy these environments. But it was really a total impact across the board. Since that $21.5 million was spent to suppress the fire, over $3 million have been spent in both the BLM and the National Forest to kind of catch up and restore some of what was there before, and hopefully restore it better. But there's a ways to go. There's probably at least $1.1 to $1.5 million of estimated costs. It's estimated by the Forest and the BLM in terms of getting back to really where we were and trying to get back better in a more sustainable way. If you look at this next slide, it kind of puts it into that recreational framework a little bit. Now you're overlaying the fire impacted area on where we walk, where we hike, where we take motorbikes, where we engage in recreation. And the whole area to the west of these communities in the Wood River Valley was impacted massively, not just in terms of literally being burned or impacted in that fashion, but also because of the access to those areas. And Harry and I actually worked on a trail count study 2 or 3 years ago before the fire. And we actually developed a model that tried to assess how many people are actually visiting out there. And we saw over 300,000 visits before the fire to the area that you're looking at in terms of visits on trails and on roads from a recreational standpoint. And we believe that this fire impacted over 100,000 of those visits. And when you think about that impact just purely from an economic standpoint, it's significant. If you think about the indirect impacts beyond that, the damage becomes even greater, but the need for resilience becomes more important as we look to the future. So the 5B Restoration Coalition was actually formed by many different partners. First, to try to get a handle on, oh man, what do we got? And how can the community actually help the forest and the BLM? And that's a bit of a new concept, right? It's also a new concept, I think, for our friends in the federal government. But I think it's something I know as one of those members of the coalition, am very proud of. It's messy, it's hard. You've got lots of different people at the table. And when I say lots of people, lots of varied people at the table. From conservation organizations to recreation organizations to public organizations, and obviously to different federal entities that are all trying to help manage these environments. What's been exciting about it is that for the first time, collectively, those groups are trying to get together to try to help restore. So far, I mentioned over $3 million has been brought to bear to try to restore and do some of these things. But there's some other notable examples, I think, that have been spurred on and assisted by the by the Restoration Coalition. The first one is over 1,000+ hours of volunteer time, and that's from 5 to 6 different organizations that have dedicated volunteer resources to come and engage in restoration directly. The second is sharing and pooling resources. So what does that actually mean? That's sharing big pieces of equipment, sharing headcount in some cases, developing cost share relationships so that more efficiently and more effectively and more quickly you can bring the right resources to bear to do some of this important work like restoring culverts and bridges and trails. And in addition to that, there's been a good amount of financial support from this community, which has been a huge, huge boon, I think, to the overall effort and will be important going forward. An example of that is the National Forest Foundation, which has helped to collaborate the whole Restoration Coalition, has just put a match together of over $100,000 in which it's inviting the community to match to directly aid some of these efforts going forward. So as we look forward, that's the big question. To me, the big challenge is that you've got a community coalition that's come together and is all trying to do everything they can to drive resilience and restoration in the short run. And I think our big challenge is going to be, how do we hold it together? How do we actually keep the urgency going right now? Because it did happen a couple years ago, and yet the impacts are still there and the gaps are still there. And so finally, in doing some of that restoration, keeping the urgency, how do we actually create more of a long-term shift to developing this coalition into one that helps us assist these federal and private land managers to really hold on to this incredible resource that is so much a part of our community in the future so that we can, in fact, respond quicker, faster, better the next time one of these disasters happens. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jim. So our last panelist is Mark Davidson. Mark is a director and member of Trout Unlimited. And Trout Unlimited is engaged in activities across the U.S., but I think more focused on some of the western states. Mark's going to talk to us a little bit today about the Idaho Trout Project. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on how
Where's
that
your video?
Yeah, I don't have any video, I don't have any technology, so I apologize.
Got a fly rod?
Yeah, I got one of those. Too many. I guess a few observations I'd like to make first. It was raining just a second ago. I want everybody to know that we're still not in the clear as it pertains to our water. We've got a ways to go yet to really get to a system where it's
the first rain I've seen.
that deals with the kind of situation we're going to be facing into the future. The other thing is, I want to make this a little interactive here to start, because what I'm going to talk about is important you understand the geographic context of water in the Wood River and how it relates to where we are right now. So how many of you have or know where Shoshone, Idaho is? So you've all either bussed down there, driven the Twin, or something. So you know where I'm talking about. Our watershed, our water that we generate in these mountains around us, actually serves a much broader community than you see as you drive up and down the Wood River Valley. It sustains an entire agricultural community, essentially from Richfield, Dietrich, Shoshone, and into Gooding. So this is a very important component when we talk about water, sustainable water, and water management into the future. The other thing to remember as you're thinking about water, and I'm not going to talk about trout, just so everybody knows. Water and trout go hand in hand, and so we need cold, clean water. I presume most in this audience would understand that. So as you think about water in Idaho, we're a prior appropriation state, and that essentially means first in time, first in right. That's another pretty important concept when you're thinking about how water is managed throughout the watershed. And many of the senior water users, if you will, are downstream of us, down in that Shoshone area I was talking about earlier. And so from a conservation standpoint, and a lot of times we think, well, that's actually good. They're moving water downstream, which in essence can help us from an in-stream perspective. But when you put it in the context of a growing community and the kind of community we have here in the Wood River Valley, that can start to create tension, especially in times of scarcity, which we've been seeing a lot of in recent years. And so, anyway, I'll come back to that here in a second. The other thing to remember is water is appropriated for a beneficial use. And beneficial use in the state of Idaho does not mean protection of fisheries, the river itself, in-stream purposes. Beneficial use means that water is diverted or pumped out of the ground to grow crops, for your lawn, for example. These are all things that take priority over our rivers themselves. So that creates another bit of difficulty for us when we think about how are we trying to protect things from a conservation standpoint and how that relates back to kind of a community context of how we're trying to protect and preserve this watershed. And then as we think about our basin specifically, and I've worked here for quite some time now, and I've been coming up here my entire life and watching this place change over my 43 years now, which feels like a lot. I was having some kind of midlife crisis this weekend. I'm not sure why. One of the things you've noticed over the years is that this place has grown by quite some amount of people, and it's really kind of expanded. And so now you start to see this kind of brewing tension growing between the agricultural users who actually have rights to most of the water and those of us who live and rely on water either for our landscaping, our parks, our schools, all these kinds of things. And that's essentially what we're seeing happening right now over the last year to 2 years, and it's probably even longer than that for those of you who've been paying attention. Right now, what we have happening, the way that the changes in our water availability and our water supply are changing, is that we have a greater demand on that water, not only from a growth perspective, but also from an irrigation community from essentially Bellevue south, in what we call the Bellevue Triangle. And then if you go across the Peekaboo Hills and you look into that, essentially the desert, where you have Richfield, Dietrich, Shoshone, all these places. And smack dab in the middle of our watershed, we have a reservoir. And that reservoir also, the Magic Reservoir, also has a priority date. The date of Magic Reservoir, roughly 1906, predates all of the groundwater in this valley. And most people are using groundwater, either for drinking water or, again, for landscaping, growing things around their houses. And in some cases, that's what golf courses use. And in other cases, you have water that's stacked on top of each other. You have really junior water rights, really senior water rights, and groundwater. And they use these things at different times, especially if you're an agricultural water user. Now, I'm only saying all these things to kind of paint the picture for you of solving a water issue is not just as simple as let's all reduce how much water we use in our house. While very important, it's much more expansive than that. And the way we think about water and the way we manage our water and the way we engage with water in our area has to consider the broader context of it and how we really create a framework that helps us manage that water better. The other piece of that is we have, Carol mentioned infrastructure on the forest. We have a terrible infrastructure, water management infrastructure. Some of you may have seen some of our water diversions we have along the Big Wood River. None of them, to my knowledge, and I've seen pretty much all of them, at least on the main stem Wood River, none of them are really that accurate as far as how they manage water. In many cases, you still have heavy equipment going in there and pushing the stream around to actually get water delivered. And that's legal. People can do that. That's nothing against their right. People chase their water all the time. We need to improve our infrastructure of how we actually can manage and manipulate that water according to different priorities and different needs as identified by a broad community. And I think the last thing I will just say about how we're trying to deal with water issues, there's been a small group of us, which actually has expanded by quite a bit in the last few months, trying to come up with a framework solution with how we're actually going to deal with this situation. Because as we've seen, and some of you might have seen in the Mountain Express in the last months, last year or so, we have a water call from the water users in the Shoshone Basin, or in the Shoshone area, Gooding area, on our groundwater rights in this area. We have another thing that's coming at us called conjunctive management. The state is looking to manage surface water and groundwater as the same thing. And that's new to us. That will be new to us. And that'll be a big challenge to figure out how to actually manage that water. As a result of that, within the Wood River watershed, so in essence, the Bellevue Triangle North, there's been the formation of groundwater districts. There's going to be 2 in our valley, one in the southern area called the Triangle Groundwater District, and then the one in the north it's being formed currently called the Galena Groundwater District. These groundwater districts get formed to, in essence, deal with water calls from more senior water rights. And there's a whole range of ways that can be dealt with. But in essence, when you think about water, the currency is water and money. That's what it is. And that's essentially what you have to realize as we start to think about what solutions look like. The thing that we have been focused on, a group of us now have been focused on, and that includes Trout Unlimited, Nature Conservancy, Wood River Land Trust, Idaho Conservation League, Water District 37, which this is part of Water District 37, the Water Master, and a number of other interested parties throughout the community, is that we've tried to identify like what is this community about, and how can we together as a community, and I'm not just saying the Wood River Valley, this is where we include the people in Shoshone. The farmers and ranchers down in that part of our watershed really matter to creating a solution. And the 3 things that we've in essence identified is what we I guess would call our core values, if for lack of a better way of saying it. I might just read them because I don't have them memorized yet. Ensuring sustainable water use for farming and ranching, preserving safe, clean drinking water to meet the needs of the Wood River watersheds. I should mention, we include Silver Creek and the Littlewood watershed as part of our big picture. And then the last is conserving riparian river habitat for fish and wildlife that rely on the Big Wood River, Silver Creek, Littlewood River, and their tributaries. So that's in essence our guiding framework for how we're trying to accomplish a solution. And the last thing I would say about how we're trying to deal with water is that, like many things, it comes down to people and relationships, and it's about trust. And if you can't find a way to build that trust with those people that you're trying to create a solution with, it becomes a big fight. If you look at what's happened on the Eastern Snake Plain down in the south of us, and the millions of dollars that have been spent. Sorry if you're an attorney in the room, but in essence, a ton of attorneys. Any water meeting I go to in the Snake River Plain, it's a bunch of guys in suits and me, and I don't wear a suit. And I can just hear the cashiers going as they're talking. We want to try to create a scenario in which we can avoid that and come at this from a solution, proactive approach that is built on some trust, that recognizes that we are all going to have to sacrifice something in order to get to a point of sustainability for our water use into the future. Thanks.
Thank you to Mark and all our panelists. I think I'd like to open it up for questions to the audience. If you have any questions of our panelists on any of these issues, would love to hear from you.
Thanks. So to what extent, and this is to Mark, are the South Gooding, Shoshone area water users receptive to the idea of working together? I mean, versus just claiming we have these rights, you guys are out of luck. And to that respect, I know there's a study that's being proposed to also look at methods for more efficiently conveying the water and things like that. And I was hoping to hear a little bit more about that as well. So kind of 2 parts.
You talking about the groundwater modeling effort, or what are you talking about as far as the study on?
I had heard that there was a study that had been commissioned by the municipalities and the water districts around here to look at water usage, and that was separate from the USGS model.
If there is, I'm not completely familiar with it, so
okay.
I apologize.
Okay, no worries.
There's about
then the other
20
one.
different studies going on.
Okay.
But I will talk to the first thing you said. Just to illustrate the point, I grew up in Jerome, Idaho, which is south of here. And you probably don't know where Jerome is. If you go into Jerome County, if you go into Jerome, Idaho, there's still on the billboard, it says a great place to live and shop. Just so in case you get sick of this place, you can go down to Jerome. Growing up, we talk about the Wood River Valley as not being part of Idaho. Now, I live here now, so I'm kind of a turncoat, I guess, to some of my Jerome County brethren and sisters. But I think that's something really important to recognize when you're talking about south of Peekaboo Hills, and even in the Bellevue Triangle to some extent. And so within that, we're trying to find, there are always people within that community that want to find a solution. They don't want to have to fight this out. They don't want to spend their money on attorneys when they really just want certainty. They want to have some idea of what's going to happen into the future. And so there has been some very small reaching out across the table. I've been meeting with that water district, the Bigwood Canal Company folks for quite some time now, trying to build some of that trust I talked about earlier. There's 3 of those guys that are pretty respected irrigators, pretty respected farmers from that country who are involved in our solution framework, if you will. So it's a bit of a stare down right now. The cities are looking at the irrigators down south saying, well, we're not going to sit, we're going to build up our war chest. And that's what they're seeing down south. And so we're trying to stave that off as much as we can by working within the cities and working with the ag community to try to bring those pieces to the table. So it's slow and we're getting traction, but I would say it's just as difficult with the municipalities in our valley as it is with the irrigators down south. That's one of our big challenges.
So I have a question follow-up for Mark. So considering our state legislature is primarily run by ag people, and to what extent, you're working locally, you can say this is local, I mean, you're working from Jerome on up, or you're from Jerome, which is great, but what do we do at a state level? And because this is a huge problem that, I mean, our state legislature is run by ag.
Yeah.
Ag gets the water.
Yeah.
And until Jerry Brown finally did something in California that, you know, it went against probably his sensibilities in terms of saying to agriculture, you actually have to conserve some water here. You know, to that extent, how are we going to manage this at a state level? And can we learn anything from what California has done?
I would say California is actually learning from us, to be honest. California does not have a system like we have in Idaho. Believe it or not, we actually have a pretty good water. Our state has largely been adjudicated. California has not. That's a pretty big deal, which always surprised me the first time I learned that, because I always think California is being so far ahead of everybody. With water, they're so far behind us all. So there's one thing that we've got in our favor. We've got at least some kind of framework. As far as changing the state dynamics, I'm the eternal optimist, so takes it with a grain of salt. I believe very firmly that we can get a community together to actually be our voice, to actually get the state to listen. And it's going to be because we've got the right relationships with the state water board. And through that, we can then influence how that water board sets policies for the Department of Water Resources. And we have one of our local representatives, Michelle Stennett, Donna Pence, are very interested in seeing us solve this problem. So I think, to answer your question, it's about having the community say what they want. That's what will change it. It's not going to be we're going to go to the state and try to get them to change it. We come up with something that is inclusive of all of us, and we take that to the State House.
I hate to pick on Mark, but we're going to give it one more shot. So
I got an answer, Brian.
Yeah, I know you do. You've got. So a number of individual speakers on the panels today, which have been excellent, of course, have talked about growth. Well, I want to talk about growth in a somewhat different light. We're coming out of the recession. You've seen some graphs in terms of economic recovery. You've seen all the new buildings go up. You've seen permitting. We heard at the CSI conference that, Mark, you attended, and a variety of people here attended as well, that in the Wood River Valley, the average per person, man, woman, and child consumption of water per day is 700 gallons. We need to look at growth. We need to look at sustainability in terms of being able to deliver water for these different uses. Now, we're fortunate in Idaho, just as you say, compared to California, where we have a lot of experience as well. Idaho knows what its water laws are. when IDWR and the Water Board begin to actually enforce conjunctive management, and the folks here, when we're talking about these communities, with 5, 10, 15 acres, many acres of which are irrigated, frankly, illegally, because there's no right other than the half acre under the 1862 Homestead Act, right? There's going to be an accounting, right? Why in Blaine County are we permitting a single additional home? Now, that may be an extreme view, but if we don't have the supply, but we increase the demand, that's starting to sound a little bit, and with apologies to Carol, whom we're very lucky to have had for 35 years in this forest, you know, that sounds like a little bit of federal government accounting in terms of our national fiscal policy. How can we continue to grow in this county and even remotely talk about or be honest in our discussion and assessment of resilience if we're increasing the demand for water?
We can't, is the short answer, Brian.
Thank you, Mark.
I have a complete WAG, all right? It's not a swag, it's a WAG. I don't know, for those of you who know what that acronym stands for, you'll get it here in a second. But I think in my estimation, and looking at it on a very coarse level, we need to reduce our demand on our water supply by at least 30%. Now that includes agriculture, that includes development, that includes the whole thing. Somehow we have got to reduce the demand. That comes through conservation, that comes through fallowing programs, that comes through drying up acres, it comes through a number of different things. But we've got to do all of these different things to actually accomplish that goal. Whether it's 30%, I don't know. So that's just me looking at the numbers and thinking about the context of the watershed.
Any other questions?
Just to kind of combine Carol and Shawn, perhaps, is there a timber industry living, and are they part of the solution to resilient forest management?
Did you say, is there a timber industry solution?
Living.
Living. Certainly, this forest is not a timber forest right around us here. You know, and in the Pacific Northwest, they would laugh about our little lodgepole trees. But certainly, we have post and pole sales, and what we do when we thin out, often we will contract out with a small-time logger to do post and pole removal or firewood sales. So to the extent that it's a living for a very tiny group, yes. We do a lot of the work ourselves. Yeah.
Okay.
Shawn?
I don't think I need to add anything to that.
Okay.
Great. So I'd like to thank our panelists and our audience. I think what I take away from this is that there's this interaction between sort of the science and action, which is really what SVIR is going to try to do, to try to create some bridges from good science to solid, sustainable, in maybe some cases, pilot actions we can take, whether it's on food or water or energy. And that's where I think we're all going to need to roll up our sleeves and try to make something happen. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks, Harry. I was just going to say one last piece about the Institute and what we're working to do is when you do have threats to our water system, how else can those farmers who may have to give up some of the water use, we're talking about a 1/3 reduction, how else can they make income? Well, a great way to make income is with solar. And if we don't have the rules in this state that allow those farmers to make money off of solar, they don't have alternatives. So we have to think of it as a system. So it's not how do we, just reduce the water use in a vacuum, but how are those people going to transition in a way that does allow us for that sustainability that you were talking about, Brian, and that's what we're working to do by bringing these folks together. And I love the combination of the national expertise and perspective with our local realities. So thank you very much, you guys, for being here.